Welcome back. So earlier studies had already established that union workers earn higher wages on average. But here in this paper, Rosen asks a little bit of a deeper question. So how do unions affect the relative wages of different occupations? If we're literally comparing between occupations. So do unions change the shape of the wage structure across jobs like laborers, craftsmen, technicians, and clerical workers? So Rosen's key insight is that unions tend to compress wages, um, and the differences in wages across occupations. So this happens because unions often bargain for uniform percentage wage increases, standard wage scales, and narrow wage differentials between occupations. Combined, these result in lower paid occupations receiving relatively larger gains, so they tend to benefit more than higher paid professions. So why would unions try to compress wages? Rosen proposes several institutional explanations based on how unions are formed and how they structure. So there is a median voter logic inside of unions, like there's a median voter logic for politics in general. So union contracts reflect the preferences of the typical member of the union. If the union membership is concentrated among mid or lower skilled workers instead of higher skilled workers, those workers, the lower or middle skilled workers, will prefer smaller wage gaps across the occupations within the union. Second, unions have solidarity norms. Think of how unions tend to describe themselves, like the old Knights of Labor. A lot of the trade unions today will call themselves brotherhoods still. Unions often emphasize the idea of equal pay for comparable work, like not equal work, but comparable work. So large pay gaps can create conflict between the groups, the different occupations within the union. So unions push for narrow wage differentials between the different occupations within their union. Finally, it's part of their bargaining strategy. So reducing occupational wage gaps can make negotiations easier for them to do. So instead of bargaining separately with the different firms or whoever they're bargaining with for each job category, unions often push for standardized wage ladders and uniform increases across the different classifications to make the negotiations simple. Now, Rosen uses the Bureau of Labor Statistics industry wage surveys, and these data report wages for multiple occupations across many different establishments, and it includes information on union coverage, which is important. So this allows Rosen to compare occupational wage differences in union versus non-union sector. And he finds that unionized sectors have smaller wage differences across occupations. Lower skilled occupations receive larger wage premiums, and higher skilled occupations receive smaller union wage premiums. So basically what happens is that unions flatten the occupational wage hierarchy. Now, standard human capital theory predicts that workers with more skills earn higher wages. But unions can alter these market outcomes by imposing institutional wage rules. Thus, unions reshape the returns to skill, reducing the earnings on the high end and increasing the earnings on the low end. Now let's turn to the other paper. So Richard Freeman takes Rosen's question and applies it to specifically looking at within firms. So how do unions affect the distribution of wages within a single firm? In other words, do unions make pay more equal among workers doing similar jobs? This is important because unions have historically promoted the principle of equal pay for equal work or equal pay for comparable work. Freeman studies whether union wage setting institutions actually reduce inequality inside of workplaces. So he begins with an institutional observation. Unions tend to favor standardized wage systems. Again, by the time Freeman was writing, pretty common knowledge. So the two common systems are single rate pay system. This is where all workers in the job receive the same wage, and automatic progression systems, where workers move through seniority-based pay steps. So as they work for a firm or in the union itself longer, they get the pay bumps over time. Many non-union workplaces have supervisors that evaluate workers individually. Sometimes there's merit pay that exists, and they use that to try to increase productivity. And wages are often determined on a case-by-case basis. And the result here in non-union shops is a tendency towards more wage dispersion. It's not necessarily good or bad, but it is a difference that we see between union and non-union shops. So Freeman uses the Bureau of Labor Statistics industry wage surveys, and this allows him to measure wage dispersion within each establishment specifically. So he dispersion is measured using the variance or standard deviation of log wages. And he finds evidence that unionized firms have much lower wage dispersion within establishments. Freeman estimates the wage dispersion is 5 to 50% lower in union workplaces. And this is a meaningful effect economically. This is a significant amount of variation that he's able to estimate. Freeman results, Freeman's results highlight a key labor economics debate. So unions may increase wage equality because they're compressing the wage distribution. But this can also mean less reward for individual productivity and fewer pay increases for, or incentives for performance through pay increases. So unions may trade this efficiency for equality. And where you stand may be determined by what kind of worker you are, and what kind of field you're in. Unions do a ton of other things besides wage negotiations. It's important to point that out. Right now, we're kind of just focusing on the effect on wages because it's a labor econ class, and the union wage effects are more interesting and pertinent to what we're talking about.